going to try and show is how I have used what appear to be very abstract and sometimes meta-theoretical ideas to inform the way I try, theorise and think, because it seems to me that that's the important thing. It's not about having a list of theorists with, you know, and citing them, but actually not doing anything with them. I think that theory is something, it's about theorisation rather than theory with a capital T. I am going to say a little bit more formally at the beginning about some of the theorists I'm using, because I'm not making the assumption that everybody's read all this stuff. So for some of you I know in the room have and are very experienced, I'm going to actually bear with me, because I really think it's important that in a sense we rehearse what we share in terms of a common understanding. So, features of critical realism. And as with any other body of thought, critical realism and realisms operate at different levels according to different theorists. So if I was talking about post-structuralism again, I would be in a sense referencing a field of theorists and a field of argumentation and a field of debate, rather than just one theorist. And so I think it's important to recognise that. Significantly, critical realism involves a series of ontological assumptions. In other words, it's concerned with questions of being, and very much part of critical realism is a set of philosophical assumptions. And Robuscar talks about this sort of meta-theoretical work as under-labouring for substantive social science. So there's an element, as it were, of clearing ground. And my argument would be that it's better to start from sensible ontological assumptions than not. In other words, that level of work, if you like, that level of intellectual work we do, is really about clarifying for ourselves where we stand on certain issues. For most intents and purposes, most of the time, the argumentation we make is not necessarily going to operate at that level. But as I say, I think it's better to actually start with sensible ontological assumptions than ones that I would argue are not so sensible, not so defensible. One of the key ontological assumptions underlying particularly Margaret Archer's work is the idea of the primacy of practice. Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenological tradition, talks about our body as our way of being in the world. So it is the assumption of a primacy of practice rather than of the discursive. And this distinguishes all forms of realism, really, from the dominant forms of anti-realism, and particularly postmodernism, post-structuralism in the modern period. There are epistemological implications that flow, so there are theories of knowing, epistemology, that flow from a series of ontological assumptions. And these are really critical naturalism. Naturalism in this context has nothing to do with the normal use of the word natural. What it means is the unity of the social and natural sciences. So critical realism distinguishes the social and the natural, but basically sees the forms of scientific knowing and what we're trying to do in getting to grips with the world as essentially about the same sort of stuff in terms of explanation, in terms of identifying generative mechanisms. So when we're theorising, when we're doing our theoretical work, the aim of that work is really to actually identify these underlying mechanisms. Now, because the nature of the stuff we're studying is different in natural social worlds, there are differences. But nonetheless, that notion of a critical naturalism, a critical unity in terms of the natural and social sciences. And that, of course, is very different from a lot of positions in the social sciences and humanities, which would really put a very firm line between the two and see the natural sciences, interestingly often of which are then just given over to positivism, local Klein and Sinker, as being very, very different from the sorts of reasoning and theorising and purposes of the social sciences and humanities. And the final overarching theme I want to talk about a little bit is Margaret Archer's work, the idea of the morphogenetic approach. And what we'll see is that theorising over time of thinking about the conditions as structuring of actually agencies then at the time too. So the notion that in a sense one's actually trying to look at the generative mechanisms, but one's looking over time, and I'll talk some more about this. So the notion of analytical dualism and time. So the first theorist I'm going to say a little bit about is the work of Roy Bhaskar. Bhaskar's work, and it's now, I think the earlier work was in the 70s, he's a philosopher, and he talks about underlabouring for the social sciences. So he asks the Transcendental Question, and this is from Kant, and it's the questions of what must the world be like in order for. So it's a sort of quite abstract question, but I think he asks it in a really interesting way. What must the world be like in order for science to be possible? In other words, what must the world be like in order for certain sorts of knowledge to be possible and certain knowledge claims? And what he argues then is that in fact both positivism and idealisms don't actually give us firm foundations for actually understanding science. And he argues that in particular positivism is actually not a good description of science. It actually cannot tell us how science works. So the notion of Humean regularity, the idea that what causation is that one thing follows another, doesn't work. In fact, constant conjunctions, regularity, is very, very rare in the natural and social worlds. Most of the time, scientists actually have to struggle to construct beautiful, elaborate experiments in order to produce regularity in artificial environments. Similarly, idealisms that actually reduce ontological questions to our knowing, so we effectively say that all we have access to is our knowing, really don't allow us to get to a grip on what the world must be like in order for science to be possible. So in contrast, what Bhaskar poses is what he calls a depth ontology. So one of the things I think about both positivism and idealism, if you like, that they're flat earth epistemologies, that they flatten the world to what we can see, touch and know at that sort of level. Critical realism actually poses a depth ontology. That we've got a stratified ontology, which means that there are mechanisms which are generative of the real, that we may not be able to see, but that are the things that we're looking for in terms of it having an explanatory purpose. So this is what he means by ontological depth. And so we're looking at stratified ontology, and what we're interested in when we're trying to make explanations is identifying the generative mechanisms. And I use mechanisms in the plural, because of course there are multiple generative mechanisms, and one of the problems is that, particularly in the social worlds, where we can't do experimental closure, we're looking at them all operating all at once. And that means sometimes some things happen and sometimes some things don't, and it depends on what's actually going on at that level. So he talks about those dimensions of science as the transitive and intransitive dimensions. The transitive dimension is our knowing. It's our intervening in order to know. So it's our meaning making. But what he claims, and all realisms make this claim, is that our knowing is of something, of an intransitive dimension, of something that exists independently of our knowing of it. So it's a rejection of the epistemic fallacy, and that is that all our knowledge is simply our knowledge, and that we have no access to a world outside ourselves. But all science and knowledge have that active transitive dimension. So this is not a denial of the sociology of knowledge. It is not a denial of thinking about power and discourse in our knowledge making. But it's about saying that that transitive dimension is the knowledge of something. And as I've mentioned, therefore, it entails critical naturalism. So I'm just going to show you this in terms of diagramming then the notion of a depth ontology. The domain of the real for a critical realist involves mechanisms. These are real, but are transfactual and not necessarily, we can't necessarily see them or touch them, but nonetheless, those mechanisms, those underlying mechanisms are real. It accepts the reality of events, facts, things, and also our experiences. Whereas what we can see over here, this is the realm of, I mean, for example, phenomenology would sit over here in terms of our experiences. Arguments that all we have access to is our experiences of the world, and the domain of the actual facts and events. And forms of positivism, and we'll say forms of positivism, because actually there are different versions of positivism too, but forms of positivism will sit over here, and idealisms will sit over here, over at this level. So at the epistemological. But the crucial thing to note is that these are all taken to be real. And so that what that does is it gives us a model of the world, as it were, that actually has ontological depth. So we think of causality. What does causality then look like in a critical realist take on the world? Well, non-regularity. In open systems, regularity, as I've suggested, is rare. And so regularity is produced in the natural sciences, in some of the natural sciences, because of course not all the natural sciences are experimental, but in some of the experimental natural sciences, through experimental control. And the paradigm case will be physics, where one can intervene to create experimental closure in very artificial situations. Now, the key to causality then is exemplifying mechanisms. And one of the things there is, again, the critical naturalism, but the ontological oddity of the social sciences is that objects are only relatively enduring. In other words, social science is context dependent. I always think about it that if we were wiped out as a species tomorrow, the subject of the natural sciences would continue to exist, i.e. the world would continue to exist. If we were all wiped out tomorrow, not only would we go, but sociology, the object of sociology would go. In other words, it's context dependent. So there is an ontological oddity that we are continually actually producing those facts that we already study. So there are differences, but what Bhaskar would argue is that in fact that often those are misdescribed as being really incommensurable, so that the project of the social sciences and the humanities become very, very different to the project of the natural sciences. And he claims, though, that we do that does have methodological implications for us, however, because experimental closure is not possible in the social sciences. Now, with apologies to any psychologists in the room, because a lot of psychologists do a lot of experiments, I think that actually it is extremely difficult to actually derive non-trivial experimental work, at the risk of offending, as I say, hosts of psychologists. But actually what you look at is that when you actually attempt to close in the social side, in the social worlds, what you tend to be doing is actually operating a closure at a level of very, very trivial variables. And so in education, for example, it's noticeable that it's often things like single health interventions are looked at. But actually, if you want to start to begin to look at really complex questions, it's really problematic. And what you find as well is that some things work in some circumstances and not in others, precisely because you have this problem of open systems and multiple mechanisms. And of course, there are huge ethical issues about experimentation in the natural science, in the social sciences. So that's a whistle-stop tour through Bhaskar. And if you're wanting to read on this, I would actually say that Roy is not an easy read, which is possibly one of the understatements of the end. And don't read the dialectic book under any circumstances. I deeply regret that I did. But Andrew Collier has written an introduction to Roy's book, Andrew Collier, and Andrew writes beautifully. And so if you're using this, start with Andrew Collier's book on Roy Bhaskar, because actually it will really give you a very, very accurate, I mean Andrew and Roy were very close, worked closely together, So, I mean, some secondary texts you actually you worry about, but in this case, actually, I think that certainly that would be where to start. Now, Margaret Archer and her morphogenetic approach. And again, Margaret Archer has developed these ideas over a whole series of books. And I would actually say that Jenny Casehaire's summary of Archer's ideas in her book is a really, really nice way to sort of dip into and start with. But basically, the morphogenetic approach is this idea of looking at change or stasis over time. So, and it's a rejection of what she calls upwards, downwards, and central conflation. So she's approaching structure and agency in a way that rejects the idea that you can reduce structure to the individual, to agency. Equally rejects the idea that agency can be reduced to structure, so we become dupes of social structure, we just carry it out. But interestingly also, she rejects Giddens and what she calls central conflation, and the idea that actually is always instantiated in the present. So I think Giddens is quite interesting because it strikes me as a sociology of a repeated present. So that sense that there is no separation. So Archer's idea is analytical dualism. And the analytical there is incredibly important because of course it's a device, it's an analytical device. It's not phenomenologically so. You know, I mean, in a sense that is, so one's making distinctions in order to do theoretical work of explanation. So what she's interested in is structure at time one, mediating through agency at time two, because structure never acts automatically, it acts through people. So we find ourselves in conditions not of our own choosing, but then in fact we come to concerns and it goes through agency. And then one either has social and cultural elaboration coming out of that, morphogenesis, or not, morphostasis. Of a whole period of human history, one can actually see that in fact the outcome of structure agency, culture agency, was morphostasis, not morphogenesis. She insists on the primacy of practice and our triune environment, so she's very interested in theorising what it means to be human. And she talks about us as having relationships with our triune environment, the natural, the practical, and the social worlds. And so in terms of actually having a rich theorisation of human beings and agency, I think Archer represents a really extraordinarily rich resource. So one of her first books is on being human, and she talks about the significance of agency. And she talks about other theorists in a sense not putting enough into agency to allow us to really theorise and talk about how people come to articulate their central concerns in life and actually come to be able to act upon them. So the nature of reflexivity, she elaborates the theory of reflexivity and the internal conversation and our ability to articulate our human concerns. And I think the idea of the internal conversation is incredibly important. Because when I look at you, I can't see myself looking back. When I'm talking to myself, which I'm sure all you're doing in your head at the moment, as well as listening to me, and Mbulu's actually probably doing it in at least 3 languages, actually that sense of that internal conversation. So it means that in fact that one's listening and one's coming to judgments at the same time. So she actually has a very interesting rejection of lots of people, James and people that have actually talked about using the idea of vision, but she argues that actually the idea of vision is highly misleading. It's also very profoundly, importantly, a rejection of Cartesian dualism, the think therefore I am, and that split between mind and body, because of course the primacy of practice. And she argues that emotion and rationality are intertwined. And she talks about the elaboration of second-order emotion in terms of how we come to make our commitments in the world. So what I hope you can see is that she's giving us a hugely rich set of ideas to work with. And again, as you remember, I was talking about realism as a theoretical resource. So one's not going to be using all these things all the time, but it is that sense of actually using theorists and using their insights in order to be able to think with. So, in thinking of critical realism as a resource then, particularly in terms of Archer, we've got substantive sociological claims. Archer is a sociologist who's making substantive sociological claims about the world, about the internal conversation, about the nature of reflexivity, and I'll talk a little bit more about the forms of reflexivity she elaborates later. There are differences between theorists in relationship to critical realism. So, for example, there is significant disagreement between Andrew Sayre and Margaret Archer about the significance of habitus. Margaret Archer is very, very critical of the notion of habitus and is defending, I think, a notion of reflexivity that would actually deny the significance of habitus. That's habitual action, but taken from a body, some people will know, sorry. Whereas Sayre is saying that actually if one thinks in terms of the primacy of practice and the bodily, actually habitus becomes quite important. I actually, personally, I think on this one, I very much think that what Andrew is saying is really important. I think he's right. So the question of critical realism as a resource, therefore, is complex. And the methodological implications depend on the purposes of our theorising and the context of the research. So in other words, this is not a rule book. Being a critical realist doesn't solve any of your problems. Because, there is that notion of theory that somehow everyone's got, particularly sometimes I think in doctoral studies, everyone's got one's theory sorted out, yippee. It's all, it's all fine, and it ain't like that. I really don't think it's just not like that. So starting with critical realism involves choices, and what C. Wright Mills in his wonderful appendix calls the sociological imagination, so the research imaginary. One's still got to actually do that research work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just very quickly show how I've used ideas from critical realism. I also think, because I've used it for different purposes, what you'll also see, I've used it to actually talk to different sorts of problems. And what you'll also see is that although I'm a researcher of higher education, I don't confine myself just to writing about higher education. We have broader commitments to other debates and things is quite important. And particularly actually in higher education research, where most of us will actually have different disciplines and actually therefore also be talking back into different spaces. So in my research, I've used particularly Archer's work in thinking about agency as a resource for critique. There were some really interesting arguments and debates that went on within feminism, and I would take myself also to be part of that world of feminist scholarship. And a real sense, the Feminist Salon was a group of women who were meeting in London, both theorists in the academy and not, and a real sense that actually that some of the language and theorising didn't actually give feminism as an agency, as a political project, if you like, scope. So in discussing how feminist theory might be taken forward, the group stresses the centrality and necessity of collectivities as enabling resistance and other forms of agency. The group felt that further exploration and analysis of the notion and the feeling of selfhood that are necessary to adequately conceptualise individual and collective agency and the ways in which structure reflects such agency and collectives. And so this was a debate that was going on about partly actually the academicisation of feminist thought and its restriction to inside the academy. So I wrote back specifically into this space. So this was a paper that had been written in Gender and Education. And what I did, and I think as you read that quote, what I hope is that you can see, oh yes, Archer would speak to that. Yeah? And so what I did was I actually drew heavily on Archer in rejecting post-structuralist accounts of subjectification, the idea that one's constantly enacting in a discursive way, reenacting identity. So that sense of a repetition of identity, which had come to dominate a lot of feminist writing. Now that second bullet point is really important, I think, but it's important to recognise the insights produced from post-structuralism. one of the problems with theory is that actually people launch paradigm wars. And so what actually happens is I'm a critical realist and you're a post-structuralist, and my goodness, we should not be speaking or sitting down together in public. There are hugely important insights that have come from post-structuralism. The level of disagreement is at this level of meta-theory and in terms of sort of some of our deep understandings. So I always say Val Hay, who's a wonderful colleague, would describe herself as a feminist post-structuralist. In terms of our substantive analysis, you can get, you get a piece of A4 paper between us. It's so thin. But actually, at a really fundamental level, we disagree. But I think it's really important not to use theory to set up false dichotomies. So what I was trying to do in this paper was both actually really disagree, but also say, but that doesn't mean that I don't recognise. And things like discourse and deconstruction, I mean, are part of our common vocabularies. Post-structuralism doesn't own that any more than critical realism does. So I think that what I was trying to do was to actually instead draw on Archer's theory of self and emergent properties, the full range of personal powers that actually we as human beings in the world have a range of personal powers that develop over time. There's a self, agent, actor, a particular person. So that I was using that to theorise, in a sense, a political subject, a social political subject for feminism, and in particular to think about what she calls corporate agents. And corporate agents, she said, is agency with a particular punch. It's when we get together to try realise projects that matter to us. So that sense, if you like, of the political. So going right back to the idea of feminism as a political project, not just an academic one. So what I was doing here was I was mobilising critical realism as a political and theoretical resource. I've carried on with that in relationship to this in terms of intersectionality. And the idea of intersectionality is really looking at those complex intersections between the operation of race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, whatever it is that one's actually interested in looking at, but actually a recognition that one doesn't just do gender. And the salience of gender may be more or less salient in particular situations. And I went back to some of the original analysis based on Kimberly Crenshaw, who used the work first in 1989, although people were actually talking about some of these intersections using different language earlier on. But it was a very material analysis. She's an academic lawyer, and she talks about the ways in the southern states that when you took law claims, employment law claims, what actually happened if you wanted to take them as a black woman was that actually the category didn't materially exist. Because if you went to law as a woman, you were dealt with under sex discrimination legislation. And so effectively what she argues is the category woman reduced to white women. Whereas actually if you took it under race discrimination, it effectively reduced to race, and the categories that were used against the women in that context were black, effectively black men. So that they could show that black men had been in the workplace, and therefore it couldn't be race discrimination, that they could show white women had been in the workplace, so you could show it wasn't sex discrimination. So the category, the lived reality of black women disappeared in that. So, but what I wanted to argue is again that actually most of these concerns in the intersectional literature, in the literature on intersectionality, is really being subsumed now into ways with a concern with subjectification. And the danger is, I think, that intersectional analysis simply becomes a deconstruction. And I think that there are analytical, but I also think there are political problems with that. That if one deconstructs the political subject, the issue about corporate agency and the ability to act and the ways in which one can exercise agency, there is a danger that that becomes completely deconstructed. And I also argue the need for substantive analysis of historically segmented structures of multiple oppressions. And so we need a morphogenetic analysis at both the cultural and social level. And that's a work of substantive social theory, which I don't do in this article. This article is a critical one. The final example I'm going to use is where I've actually written and used critical realism as a source of critique. So this is not a substantive work, but it's a source of critique. Was of evidence-based practice. And this, comes from within medicine particularly, where the idea of systematic review of the papers that are being published, using the gold standard of randomized controlled trials and then summarized in systematic review. This got taken up in health, in nursing, in education, and certainly was very, very important and significant in policy terms. So what we were seeing was that actually the idea of evidence-based was being mobilized very powerfully politically in policy arenas. So what I did was I went back to Roy Bascar's work, and also Ray Pawson, who's really written very interestingly on the nature of evaluation. And what I tried to show was how systematic review is procedurally rigorous, but lacks an adequate concept of scientificity. What basically you do is you get absolutely consistent search terms. You then search every sort of available source, including grey sources. What you do is you end up producing huge lists of papers. You then apply a pseudo gold standard quality measure, and you end up with papers, and you say these are the important papers. Maggie McClure, in an absolutely brilliant essay, talks about it as a strategy for not reading, because you don't actually read, you do this sort of thing. Now what it means is that in fact that what you get is a whole series of papers that have only been sifted against these quality criteria. So that in the UK higher education context, there was a systematic review of personal development planning because our QAA had mandated it across the system. And they literally have tens of thousands of papers they looked at. They applied the quality criteria, and I think it was in the 20s that they ended up with. Lo and behold, most of them were American. Well, I could have told them that without doing anything, because actually Americans do that sort of work. It's part of their PhD programs. They're the people who do this sort of type of work. And so I was at the launch of this, and there was a group of practitioners, and the guy stood up and talked for quite a long time. And then he said, personal development planning worked. And one of the members of the audience said, could you tell us why? Because obviously if you're a practitioner, you want to know why, so you can actually do something with it in your classroom setting. He said the research isn't designed to tell us that. So what you find is some things work in some contexts and not in others. And the problem with program evaluations and systematic review is because we don't have invariance, you need to actually know why something's working. Because that's what's the important thing. In other words, you need to understand the generative mechanisms. So this was a sort of example of, in a sense, where I was speaking into something that was a live issue in relationship again to the literature. So those are examples of where I've used critical realism as a basis for critique. But I want to actually talk also about where I was using empirical work. And again, I'm going to use the example of personal development planning. Because like many of you, I've often been in situations where I've been asked to research something by my institution or by other colleagues because it's of current and contemporary curriculum importance of teachers in that situation. So personal development planning is the beguilingly beautifully simple idea that what you do is you reflect. You ask students to reflect, and then they reflect, and then they plan, and then they improve. And the notion of development of metacognitive capabilities and so on. So what I got to thinking about was actually working with Archer's notion of various forms of reflexivity, and arguing that this notion of planning, it's a very rational notion of planning, privileges only one form of reflexivity, i.e. autonomous reflexivity. That's the form of reflexivity that, if you like, is orientated towards social mobility. And of course, not coincidentally, this fits in with notions of the employability gender, and that whole notion of the purpose of the university education, in a sense, is partly actually to fulfill the individual desires of people in terms of social mobility. So it also entails a particular sorts of temporality. And I looked at work from Adam and Groves, who is a theorist of time, And they talk about the ways in which the future is projected as empty and open, whereas of course in fact the future is already full. I mean, both in an ecological sense in terms of what the mechanisms are projecting into the future. Stuff we've done now is going to go on, some of it, for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. But also in the sense that the future is already stratified in terms of the outcomes and possibilities for our students. The future isn't there just empty and ready to be made, regardless. So, from empirical work, it became very clear that many of our students failed to reflect in a way that was being assumed, both in the pedagogy and at the policy level. So, we were drawing on Archer, and although we were doing something slightly different, we were not we were not claiming to be investigating the internal conversation. Rather, we were thinking about how reflexivity that was evidenced in our interviews about the experiences and intentions towards HE. So we were looking at the different forms of reflexivity that we were finding in our students, and particularly thinking about students who work at staying put. So often, in fact, that form of reflexivity is just seen as a negative, as an empty box. And actually we were using Archer's categories to think about different forms of reflexivity and the internal conversation. So taking the ideas, but really working in some ways in a very mundane way in terms of the site, as it were, but using it to really theorise. So in our data, as I suggested, what we found then was communicative and meta-reflexivity. And so we were really looking at this in relationship to adding to a critique of curriculum assumptions. Communicative reflexivity is that form of reflexivity where you bounce back from members of your community, that your internal conversation is validated by other people. So it is the reflexivity, as it were, of staying put, but is nonetheless reflexivity. I think we just say often our students aren't being reflexive when they engage in that sort of thing. Meta-reflexivity is actually that form of reflexivity when one comes to make commitments to projects, even if in fact they may be against one's short-term immediate interests. So I wasn't just drawing on Archer in this work, I was drawing on Michael Young, Basil Bernstein, Adam Grove, and work on future cells, which is mostly actually American work that's come from schools. And I've joked in the past that I'm theoretically promiscuous, because I'm very happy to draw together different theorists. So it's again this thing about what is the work of theorization. So I'm not hanging my hat on a man whose initial is B. One gets Bourdieu and Bernstein and people, and that sort of sense of theory as somebody, so I've got my pigeonhole. So I'm very willing to actually look to the sorts of theory that actually speaks to the work I'm doing. I would defend it in the sense that it's not atheoretical, and it's knowing. And I know where, in fact, there are gaps between the theories, and I'm very explicit about them. But I'm clear about the work that I'm making, theory do, for me to actually try and understand what are multiply determined complex situations. And I've described elsewhere, I wrote a paper for Herd called On the Problem of Theorization, about the messy process of theorizing and intellectual craftsmanship. So, as I said right at the beginning, theorization is tricky and non-linear. And the most recent thing I'm trying to do is, and this is absolutely work in progress, is I'm trying to think about powerful knowledge and curriculum. And why it's tricky is because I want to think about powerful knowledge in a way that actually I think gets away from what I can see as some of the potentially conservative with a small c. So I think that's why it's work in progress. So I'm looking at vocationalisation, and you can see that Lisa Whelan's term, so that work that I've been thinking about and doing in relationship to what we call our employability agenda. I was really interested when I was looking at PDP of actually distinguishing the ways in which different areas of curriculum actually took the PDP project and made it their own. So in science and humanities, the personal development planning initiative was actually reintegrated and reinterpreted in terms of their own disciplinary priorities. Whereas in some already regionalised, and Bernstein talks about knowledge that looks outwards from the academy, towards the market, outwards towards other interests, in those areas PDP became a much more generic phenomenon. And I think with all sorts of problematic concepts, implications for students. So looking at those processes of the generic, where I'm interested in the generic is that I think Bernstein actually talks about regionalisations looking outwards to the market. I'm really interested, for example, in where curricula looked outwards towards social movements. So a lot of the critiques that came into sociology were actually from feminism, and actually feminism didn't originate in the academy. You know, I mean, I did sociology in 1967, and it was sociology I lie not of white men. And at the only time women were mentioned was something called women's two roles. I missed an awful lot of those classes. I mean, you know, as a working class young woman, two roles, I really wasn't in that curriculum. And it was voices outside the academy that challenged that curriculum and made newer, better knowledge claims, I would argue. So I've also been looking at Maton and Neuron knowledge codes, and I commend both Cathy and Sue Ellen if you're interested in these areas, because they've both been doing absolutely fantastic work in that area. But where I differ from Michael Young, is that, and some of the people in this area, is that they don't think they need the critical realist ontology to ground it. And my anxiety is if you don't have that actually the knowledge claims become arbitrary, and that therefore that there is a danger of a form of circularity in which powerful knowledge becomes simply the knowledge of the powerful. So that's what I'm working at. I'm not sure I've got it right yet, but you can see that what theorisation means is that you're pushing to try make sense of stuff and working with theorists, but it's also speaking back to theory. Theorising is not a passive process. So my guess is that the challenges to us is the contextual nature of interventions. I'd suggest that there's little work in the sociology of higher education, including my own, is designed with a clear morphogenetic sequence. We tend to do one-offs. That's partly a function of funding. I've never had a big research grant that would have allowed me to have done that sort of work. So there are issues of funding and scale. I think it's often easier to do the critique bit than it is to do the positive theorising. And I can see some people grinning with absolute recognition. And I think that that is true, that sort of sometimes the underlabouring, the deconstructive moment, you know, one can do that. And in the problem of theorising, the paper I was talking about, I describe how I thought I'd done all that, and then I was left with, oh, so what do I do now? That sort of, yeah. So I mean, if you're interested, by all means, read that, and I'll send it to Nicole. I detect away from shifts from constructivist accounts back to knowledge and curriculum more generally. But again, I think it's really important, remember my caution about post-structuralism. This is not actually setting up paradigm wars, because those would be deeply unhelpful. And what constructivism, and particularly in the academic literacies tradition, has taught us so much about is about the nature of discourse and the power of those in relationship to power as well. And I'm really interested, which is why it's such an utter delight to be here, in the ways critical realism is developed, particularly in HE, but particularly here in South Africa, as you're wrestling with issues such as social and epistemic access. So thank you very much.